Picture this. You're standing in the shadow of the Palatine Hill in Rome. The year is 2018 CE, and the air itself seems to vibrate with whispered rumors and barely contained panic. The marble facades of the imperial palaces gleam white-hot under the Mediterranean sun, but there's something rotten festering beneath all that pristine beauty. You can smell it, the cloying sweetness of exotic perfumes mixing with the metallic tang of spilled wine, and something else, something darker that makes your stomach turn. From behind the gilded doors of the imperial residence comes the sound of flutes and drums, but it's not the dignified music of state ceremonies. This is wild, primal, intoxicating, the kind of rhythm that makes your pulse quicken and your mind fog with forbidden thoughts. A slave rushes past you, his face pale as limestone, clutching a golden chalice so tightly his knuckles have gone white. His eyes dart left and right as if he's afraid someone might be watching, might report back to whom exactly. The emperor. But which emperor? The one who was supposed to be ruling? Or the 14-year-old Syrian boy who somehow managed to seize the throne and turn the greatest empire in human history into his personal playground? You press yourself against a column as a group of Praetorian guards march by, their faces grim beneath their bronze helmets. Even they, the elite protectors of imperial power, look uncertain, confused. One of them mutters something under his breath about abomination and the god's punishment, but he says it so quietly you almost think you imagined it. From within the palace, a voice rises above the music, young, clear, but commanding in a way that makes your skin crawl. It's giving orders in accented Latin, but the words themselves are lost in the chaos of celebration. Or is it celebration? The longer you listen, the more it sounds like something else entirely, something desperate, something mad. This is Rome at its most dangerous hour, when the boy they call Elagabalus sits on the throne of the Caesars, and nobody, not the Senate, not the Praetorian Guard, not even the gods themselves, seems to know what to do about it. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand how Rome fell into the hands of a 14-year-old who would reshape the empire according to desires no one had dared speak aloud, we need to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of Rome, that's a story for another day, but the beginning of the end of the Severan dynasty, when the cracks in the imperial system split wide enough for something unprecedented to crawl through. The boy who would become Emperor Elagabalus was born Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, around 2004 CE, in the ancient city of Emesa, in what we now call Syria. But even that name, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, was a lie, a political fiction designed to connect him to the great philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius. His real name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, and he was born into a family of ambitious Syrian aristocrats who understood that in the Roman Empire, blood meant nothing if you couldn't convince people it meant everything. Picture young Varius in those early years in Emesa, growing up in the shadow of the great temple of Elagabal, the sun god whose black stone meteorite had fallen from heaven to become the focal point of Syrian religious devotion. The temple dominated the city's skyline, its walls echoing with the chants of priests and the cries of sacred prostitutes, the air thick with incense and the copper smell of animal sacrifice. This wasn't Rome, with its marble forums and rational architecture. This was the East, where religions mixed and merged like colors bleeding into water, where the boundaries between sacred and profane, male and female, human and divine were fluid, negotiable, ecstatic. In Rome, you worshipped the gods by offering them respect and the proper rituals. In Emesa, you worshipped by becoming them, by letting them possess your body and speak through your voice until you couldn't tell where you ended and the divine began. Varius's mother was Julia Soamius, a woman whose ambition burned so bright it could have powered the lighthouse at Alexandria. She was the niece of Julia Domna, who had been married to Emperor Septimius Severus and had tasted the intoxicating power of being an empress. When Julia Domna died in 217 CE, shortly after the assassination of her son Emperor Caracalla, she left behind a network of Syrian women who had grown accustomed to wielding influence from the shadows of imperial power. But shadows weren't enough for Julia Soamius. She wanted her son on the throne, and she was willing to tear the empire apart to put him there. The opportunity came when Emperor Macrinus, the man who had orchestrated Caracalla's murder, made the fatal mistake of trying to cut the pay of the legions stationed in Syria. Roman soldiers were many things, but patient wasn't one of them, especially when it came to their wages. Julia Soaemius saw her chance and struck like a serpent. She began spreading the rumor that young Varius was actually Caracala's illegitimate son, born of a secret affair with his beloved sister. It was a lie so audacious, so scandalous, that it almost had to be true. In a world where political legitimacy came from bloodlines, claiming that your 14-year-old son was the bastard child of a dead emperor was either the most brilliant con in history or the most dangerous. Picture the scene in the Syrian camp of Legio III Gallica in May 2018 CE. The soldiers have been grumbling for months about their reduced pay, their loyalty to Emperor Macrinus, hanging by threads thinner than spider silk. Then Julia Soaemius arrives with her son, dressed in the purple robes of imperial office, his young face painted with cosmetics in the Eastern style, his movements graceful and androgynous in ways that both fascinate and disturb the hardened veterans. She stands before them and tells them who he really is, the son of their beloved Caracalla, the rightful heir to the throne that has been stolen from him. But more than that, she tells them he's the living embodiment of Elagabal, the Syrian sun god, born to bring a new golden age to the empire. The soldiers look at this painted boy child, this creature who seems to exist in the space between male and female, human and divine, and something stirs in their blood. Maybe it's genuine religious fervor. Maybe it's just the promise of better pay, and the chance to be on the winning side of a civil war. Maybe it's something darker, some collective madness that seizes groups of men when they're far from home and faced with the impossible. Whatever it is, they kneel. The proclamation echoes across the camp like thunder. Hail Caesar, hail Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, hail Elagabalus. The name they give him, Elagabalus, isn't even his real name, it's the name of his god, and by taking it, he's claiming to be not just emperor, but deity incarnate. Emperor Macrinus, receiving word of the rebellion in his palace in Antioch, must have felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This wasn't just another military revolt. Those happened every few years and could usually be bought off or crushed. This was something new, something that combined political ambition with religious mania in ways that made it almost impossible to counter with conventional tactics. Picture Macrinus in his private chambers, scrolling through dispatch after dispatch from his spies and commanders. The reports all say the same thing. The boy isn't just claiming to be emperor, he's claiming to be God. His followers aren't just soldiers looking for better pay, they're converts to a new form of imperial worship that makes the traditional Roman ceremonies look pale and lifeless by comparison. And the boy himself, the descriptions are so bizarre that Macrinus probably thinks his informants are exaggerating. They describe a 14-year-old who dresses sometimes as a man, sometimes as a woman, sometimes as something in between, who performs religious ceremonies that involve dancing and singing, and what the Romans would have called unnatural acts, who speaks of marriage not just to women but to men, to gods, to concepts that don't even have names in Latin. This isn't just rebellion, it's revolution. It's an attack on everything Rome represents. Masculine virtue, rational governance, the clear boundaries between citizen and subject, human and divine, acceptable and abominable. Macrinus marshals his forces and marches south to crush this Syrian uprising before it can spread. But as his army approaches the rebel camp, something extraordinary happens. His own soldiers begin to waver, to whisper among themselves about the boy emperor who claims to be the sun god reborn. The battle, when it comes, is less a military engagement than a mass conversion. Macrinus's troops, seeing the exotic splendor of Elagabalus's retinue, hearing the hypnotic rhythms of Syrian war drums, witnessing the religious ecstasy of soldiers who believe they're fighting for a living god, simply switch sides. Picture the moment when Macrinus realizes he's lost. His carefully trained legions, the disciplined backbone of Roman military might, are deserting en masse to join a teenage Syrian mystic who promises them not just victory, but spiritual transformation. The emperor who had murdered his way to power finds himself abandoned by the very forces he'd counted on to keep him there. Macrinus flees, but there's nowhere to run. Within days he's captured and executed, his head sent to Elagabalus as proof that the old order is dead. The boy who was born Varius Avitus Bassianus, who became Marcus Aurelius Antoninus through political fiction, who styled himself Elagabalus after his sun god, is now the undisputed master of the Roman Empire. But mastery and control are two very different things. But the journey from Syria to Rome takes months, and it's unlike any imperial procession in Roman history. Picture the caravan that winds its way across the eastern Mediterranean and up the Italian peninsula. Traditional Roman soldiers marching alongside Syrian priests, purple-clad imperial officials walking next to painted courtesans, sacred prostitutes sharing the road with Praetorian guards, who still aren't quite sure what they've gotten themselves into. At the center of it all is Elagabalus himself, traveling in a golden chariot pulled by white horses, his appearance changing from day to day in ways that leave witnesses struggling for words. Sometimes he presents as a Roman emperor should, toga perfectly draped, bearing dignified, every inch the inheritor of Augustus and Trajan. Other times he appears in flowing Syrian robes, his face painted with cosmetics, jewelry glittering at his throat and wrists, looking more like a temple dancer than a military commander. But it's not just his appearance that unsettles people, it's his behavior. Roman emperors were expected to be distant, dignified, accessible only through carefully choreographed ceremonies. Elagabalus throws himself into crowds, touches common soldiers, engages in public displays of religious ecstasy that leave observers unsure whether they're witnessing divine inspiration or madness. The closer the procession gets to Rome, the more reports filter back to the capital about what's coming. The Senate, those ancient arbiters of Roman tradition, receive messenger after messenger, describing scenes that seem to belong in Oriental fairy tales rather than serious political reality. The new emperor is said to dance in public, to wear women's clothing, to perform religious ceremonies that involve activities that senators prefer not to discuss in polite company. Picture the debates that must have raged in the Curia, the ancient Senate house where Rome's political elite gathered to pretend they still had real power. Some senators argue for resistance. Surely the Praetorian Guard can be counted on to defend Roman traditions against this Eastern corruption. Others counsel acceptance. The boy has the loyalty of the legions, and challenging him might mean civil war. But beneath all the political calculations is a deeper anxiety, a sense that something fundamental is about to change. For centuries, Rome has been expanding eastward, conquering territories and absorbing their peoples, but always maintaining its essential Roman character. Now, for the first time, the East is coming to Rome not as a conquered territory but as a conqueror, bringing gods and customs and ways of thinking that threaten to transform the empire from within. When Elagabalus finally enters Rome in the summer of 2019 CE, the city holds its breath. Picture the scene as his procession passes through the gates, crowds lining the streets, some cheering, others silent with shock or fear. The new emperor rides in his golden chariot, but he's not alone. Beside him is a massive black stone, the sacred meteorite of Elagabal, brought from Syria to serve as the centerpiece of a new religious order. This isn't just a political transition, it's a spiritual invasion. The boy emperor isn't content to rule Rome. He wants to transform it, to remake the capital of the world in the image of his Syrian homeland. And he has the power to do it. The first sign of what's to come appears within days of his arrival. Elagabalus announces that he will marry the stone of Elagabale to Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom and warfare. It's a ceremony that has no precedent in Roman religious tradition, a mixing of Syrian and Roman deities that horrifies the traditional priesthood. But that's just the beginning. Within weeks, the new emperor has begun construction of a massive temple on the Palatine Hill, dedicated not to Jupiter or Mars or any of the traditional Roman gods, but to Elagabal. The sound of hammers and chisels echoes across the city as workers labor to create a monument to a god most Romans have never heard of. Picture the confusion and fear that grips the capital as news of each new outrage spreads through the streets. The emperor has appointed Syrian priests to positions of power in the Roman religious hierarchy. He's introduced new ceremonies that involve dancing and music and what witnesses describe as unspeakable acts. He's begun wearing women's clothing in public, not as a disguise or a joke, but as a statement of nobody knows, and that uncertainty is almost worse than knowledge would be. The traditional Roman aristocracy watches in horror as their carefully ordered world dissolves into chaos. These are men who trace their lineages back to the founding of the Republic, who see themselves as the guardians of Roman virtue and tradition. They've weathered civil wars and barbarian invasions, but they've never faced anything like this. An emperor who seems determined to destroy everything they hold sacred. But it's not just the aristocracy that's unsettled. Common Romans, too, find themselves struggling to understand what's happening to their city. The emperor they see in public ceremonies bears little resemblance to the marble statues of Augustus or the stern portraits of Marcus Aurelius. This is something new, something unprecedented, something that challenges their basic assumptions about power and gender and the nature of imperial authority itself. Picture a typical Roman citizen, perhaps a shopkeeper or a craftsman, trying to explain to his children why their emperor sometimes dresses like a woman, why the new religious ceremonies sound more like parties than worship, why the palace echoes with music and laughter at all hours of the day and night. How do you maintain respect for imperial authority when that authority is exercised by someone who seems to delight in violating every expectation of how an emperor should behave? The answer for many Romans is that you don't. You adapt, you survive, you try to profit from the chaos if you can. The smart money in Rome quickly learns to flatter the new emperor's Syrian courtiers, to adopt Eastern fashions, to at least pretend enthusiasm for the exotic new religious practices. Those who resist openly tend to disappear, not always permanently, but long enough to send a clear message about the new rules of the game. But beneath the surface compliance, resentment builds like pressure in a sealed vessel. Rome has always been a conservative society, suspicious of change and fiercely protective of its traditions. Having those traditions not just challenged but actively mocked by a teenage emperor who claims divine authority is more than many Romans can bear. The Praetorian Guard, in particular, begins to show signs of strain. These are professional soldiers who have sworn loyalty to the emperor, but their definition of emperor assumed certain basic characteristics: Roman birth, masculine bearing, respect for traditional values. Elagabalus embodies none of these things, and his behavior becomes increasingly erratic as he settles into power. Picture the scene in the Praetorian barracks as news filters in of the emperor's latest outrage. Today he's announced his intention to marry one of his male courtiers. Tomorrow he'll declare himself the reincarnation of Venus. Next week he'll order the construction of public baths where men and women will bathe together, where the normal rules of Roman modesty will be suspended in favor of Syrian customs that most Romans consider deeply immoral. The guards mutter among themselves, their loyalty tested by each new revelation. They're trained to follow orders, but what happens when those orders come from someone who seems to have no understanding of Roman law, Roman custom, or Roman dignity? How long can institutional loyalty survive when it's strained by daily humiliation? The crisis deepens as Elagabalus begins to interfere more directly in the traditional workings of Roman government. He appoints Syrian favorites to positions of power, often based on their physical beauty rather than their administrative competence. He disrupts Senate meetings with religious ceremonies that senators find both blasphemous and embarrassing. He issues edicts that contradict centuries of Roman legal precedent, seemingly on whim rather than through any coherent policy. Picture a Senate session in the second year of Elagabalus's reign. The ancient chamber where Cicero once delivered his Catiline orations, where Augustus carefully managed the transition from republic to empire, now echoes with the sound of Syrian flutes and the scent of Eastern incense. The emperor arrives not in traditional Roman dress but in flowing robes that shimmer with gold thread, his face painted with cosmetics, his movements graceful and androgynous. He announces that he's received a vision from Elagabal, that the sun god has revealed new laws that must be implemented immediately. The senators sit in stunned silence as he describes regulations that would fundamentally alter Roman marriage customs, that would give legal recognition to relationships between men, that would permit practices the Roman legal code has always condemned as contrary to public morality. When one elderly senator dares to object, to invoke tradition and precedent, Elagabalus's response is swift and chilling. The man isn't executed. That would be too crude, too obviously tyrannical. Instead, he's assigned to a minor administrative post in a remote province, effectively exiled from the political center of the empire. The message is clear. Adaptation is rewarded, resistance is punished. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Elagabalus's reign isn't his violation of political norms, it's his violation of gender norms. In a society where masculine virtue is considered the foundation of civic order, where the emperor is expected to embody the ideal of Roman manhood, Elagabalus presents something entirely different. Ancient sources describe him wearing women's clothing, using feminine cosmetics, even going so far as to seek out physicians who might be able to transform his male body into a female one. Modern historians debate whether this represents genuine gender dysphoria or simply political theater designed to shock and intimidate. But for contemporary Romans, the distinction is irrelevant. What matters is that their emperor, the living symbol of Roman power and authority, appears to reject the very concept of masculine leadership that has defined their civilization for centuries. Picture the whispered conversations in Roman homes as families struggle to understand what they're witnessing. Fathers try to explain to their sons why the emperor sometimes appears in public, wearing silk gowns and pearl necklaces. Mothers wonder what example this sets for their daughters, what message it sends about the nature of power and authority. Traditional gender roles, already under strain in a cosmopolitan empire that includes peoples from Britain to Egypt, suddenly seem fragile, negotiable, open to challenge. The emperor's personal relationships become the subject of endless speculation and gossip. He's said to have married multiple times, to women, to men, to his own courtiers, to foreign princes, to gods themselves in elaborate religious ceremonies. Each new union is announced with great fanfare, complete with public celebrations that blend Roman pageantry with Syrian religious ritual in ways that leave observers unsure whether they're witnessing a wedding or a religious initiation. But it's not just the marriages themselves that scandalize Rome. It's the way Elagabalus talks about them. He speaks openly of his desire to be dominated, to be treated as a woman in his relationships with men. He discusses sexual practices that Romans consider not just immoral, but literally unspeakable, things that are done in the shadows of the city's brothels but never acknowledged in polite society. Picture the shock of Roman aristocrats accustomed to emperors who project strength and dominance, who embody the masculine ideals of the warrior citizen. Now they have a ruler who seems to delight in submission, who takes pleasure in activities that Roman culture associates with weakness and femininity. It's not just politically dangerous, it's psychologically destabilizing, challenging assumptions about power and gender that have been central to Roman identity for centuries. The religious dimension of Elagabalus's reign adds another layer of complexity to an already unprecedented situation. His worship of the Syrian sun god isn't just a personal preference. It's a systematic attempt to remake Roman religion in the image of Eastern mysticism. The traditional Roman approach to the gods, based on contractual relationships and proper ritual observance, gives way to something more ecstatic, more personal, more dangerous. Picture the scene in the new temple of Elagabal, as the emperor leads his court in worship. The black stone meteorite, brought from Syria at enormous expense, sits at the center of the sanctuary, surrounded by golden altars and silk hangings. The air is thick with incense and the sound of exotic music, drums and flutes and stringed instruments that no Roman temple has ever heard. The emperor himself leads the ceremony, his movements part dance, part religious ritual, part theatrical performance. He sings in languages most of his audience doesn't understand, calling on gods whose names they've never heard. The traditional Roman toga has been replaced by flowing robes that blur the line between masculine and feminine, between imperial and priestly, between human and divine. The courtiers who surround him have been carefully chosen for their beauty and their willingness to participate in these exotic rituals. Some are Syrian nobles who understand the religious context. Others are Roman aristocrats who've adapted to the new regime. Still others are slaves and freedmen who've been elevated to positions of influence based on their physical appeal or their enthusiasm for the emperor's spiritual experiments. To traditional Romans watching from the margins of the ceremony, it looks less like worship than like an elaborate performance designed to shock and titillate. The boundaries between sacred and profane, between public ceremony and private indulgence, have been dissolved in favor of something that seems to celebrate excess for its own sake. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps Elagabalus's reign isn't just about personal gratification or political power. Perhaps it's about transformation, about using the authority of the imperial office to remake Roman society according to a completely different set of values. If so, it's an experiment on an unprecedented scale, using the greatest empire in human history as a laboratory for ideas about gender, sexuality, and religious authority that won't be seen again for centuries. The question is whether the empire can survive the experiment. By the third year of his reign, the strains are beginning to show. The Senate is increasingly restive. The Praetorian Guard is showing signs of disloyalty, and provinces throughout the empire are reporting unrest as local populations struggle to understand what's happening in the capital. Economic problems, too, are mounting. The emperor's lavish spending on religious ceremonies and palace entertainments is draining the imperial treasury. His appointment of incompetent favorites to administrative positions is disrupting the efficient governance that has kept the empire running for centuries. His religious innovations are alienating traditional constituencies without creating new sources of support strong enough to replace them. Picture the growing desperation of Julia Soaemias, the emperor's mother, as she realizes that her ambitions may have unleashed forces beyond her control. She had wanted her son on the throne, but she had assumed that once there he would govern like a traditional emperor, perhaps with some Syrian influences, but fundamentally within the bounds of Roman precedent. Instead, she finds herself watching helplessly as he transforms the empire into something unrecognizable, something that may not survive the shock of such rapid change. The same qualities that made him an effective rebel leader, his charisma, his willingness to challenge convention, his ability to inspire fanatical loyalty, are proving to be liabilities as a ruler. The boy who claimed to be the living embodiment of the sun god is burning too brightly, consuming everything around him in the intensity of his vision, and like the sun itself, he may be too powerful, too alien, too dangerous for the world he's trying to illuminate. The Roman Empire has weathered many crises in its long history: civil wars, barbarian invasions, economic collapse, plague, but it has never faced anything quite like this. An emperor who seems determined to destroy the very foundations of Roman civilization in order to build something entirely new in its place. Whether that destruction represents liberation or catastrophe depends entirely on your perspective. For those who have thrived under the traditional Roman system, the aristocratic families, the professional soldiers, the conservative religious establishment, Elagabalus represents everything that's wrong with the modern world, everything that threatens the values and institutions that have made Rome great. But for others, slaves and freedmen, women and sexual minorities, followers of foreign religions, anyone who has been marginalized by Roman society's rigid hierarchies, the emperor's reign offers a tantalizing glimpse of what might be possible if the old rules could be swept away entirely. The tension between these two visions of Rome's future will ultimately determine not just Elagabalus's fate, but the fate of the empire itself. The boy emperor who came to power, promising transformation, has succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The question now is whether Rome can survive being transformed. As we'll see, the answer to that question will come sooner than anyone expects, and in ways that no one could have predicted. The reign of Elagabalus is approaching its climax, and the forces that brought him to power are about to turn against him, with a violence that will shock even those who have grown accustomed to his innovations. But that's a story for what comes next, when the sun god's chosen representative on earth discovers that even divine authority has its limits, and that some transformations exact a price that no one is prepared to pay. The palace servants whisper that the emperor has been having dreams again, not the prophetic visions he usually claims, filled with golden light and divine instructions, but darker things, shadows moving in the corners of his chamber, voices calling his name in languages he doesn't recognize, the sound of footsteps that stop whenever he turns to look. Maybe it's guilt finally catching up with him, maybe it's fear, or maybe, after 4 years of claiming to be the living embodiment of a god, he's starting to realize that gods aren't the only supernatural forces that take an interest in mortal affairs. The other gods, the Roman ones he's displaced, the Eastern deities he's offended, the spirits of the ancestors whose traditions he's desecrated, might have something to say about his cosmic reorganization of the divine order. Picture him in those restless nights pacing the marble floors of his private chambers, while his latest husband, a charioteer named Heracles, who supposedly resembles the emperor's idealized vision of masculine beauty, sleeps peacefully in their bed. The boy who once commanded legions with absolute confidence now jumps at shadows, starts at unexpected sounds, finds himself constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. His behavior during the day becomes increasingly erratic. Court sessions that once showcased his theatrical flair now dissolve into rambling monologues about cosmic conspiracies and divine persecution. He orders the execution of servants for imagined slights, then pardons them minutes later when the mood passes. His religious ceremonies grow more elaborate and more desperate, as if he's trying to drown out those midnight voices with increasingly frantic displays of devotion. The Syrian priests who once served as his spiritual advisors begin to distance themselves from the emperor's inner circle. These are men who understand the difference between genuine religious experience and psychological breakdown, and what they're seeing from Elagabalus increasingly resembles the latter. When your god emperor starts claiming that rival deities are stalking him through the palace corridors, it's time to start looking for new employment. Julia Soaemias watches her son's deterioration with growing alarm. This isn't the confident young man who seized an empire through sheer force of personality. This is something broken, something that's been pushed beyond its limits, and is starting to crack under the pressure. She's sacrificed everything, her reputation, her principles, the stability of the empire itself, to put him on the throne, and now she's watching him destroy himself with the same reckless abandon he's brought to destroying Roman tradition. She tries to intervene to surround him with more competent advisors, to moderate his most extreme impulses. But Elagabalus is beyond moderation now. He's caught in a spiral of paranoia and megalomania that feeds on itself, growing stronger with each perceived slight, each whispered criticism, each sign that his divine authority isn't as absolute as he believed. The breaking point comes in the winter of 2021 CE, during one of the emperor's increasingly elaborate religious festivals. Picture the scene in the temple of Elagabal, hundreds of courtiers packed into the sacred space, the air thick with incense and sweat, and barely controlled hysteria. The emperor stands before his black stone meteorite, arms raised toward the heavens, calling on his patron deity to manifest physically in the temple. But something goes wrong. Maybe it's the pressure of performing miracles on command. Maybe it's the accumulated stress of 4 years of trying to transform an empire through willpower alone. Maybe it's just the natural consequence of a teenage mind pushed beyond its breaking point by impossible responsibilities and unlimited power. Whatever the cause, Elagabalus collapses during the ceremony. Not a graceful swoon designed for dramatic effect, but a genuine loss of consciousness that leaves him convulsing on the temple floor, while his horrified courtiers try to decide whether they're witnessing divine possession or imperial breakdown. When he recovers, hours later, something fundamental has changed. The boy who once radiated confidence and charisma now seems hollow, diminished, as if some essential part of his personality has been burned away by whatever he experienced during his collapse. He speaks in whispers about betrayal, about enemies gathering in the shadows, about the gods themselves turning against him. The rumors spread through Rome like wildfire. The emperor is mad. The emperor is dying. The emperor has been possessed by demons. The emperor has been abandoned by his own god. Each version of the story is more sensational than the last, but they all point to the same conclusion. The supernatural authority that has sustained Elagabalus's reign is crumbling, leaving behind only a confused and frightened young man who's made too many enemies to survive without divine protection. Julia Mamaea, Elagabalus's aunt, and the mother of his cousin Alexander Severus, sees her opportunity. She's been watching from the margins for 4 years, carefully building networks of support among the very Roman traditionalists, who've been most alienated by her nephew's reign. Where Julia Soaemias bet everything on Syrian exoticism and divine authority, Julia Mamaea has positioned herself as the champion of Roman values and imperial restoration. Her son Alexander is everything Elagabalus is not. Conventionally masculine, respectful of tradition, trained in Roman law and administration rather than Syrian mysticism. At 13, he's already showing signs of the kind of steady, competent leadership that the empire desperately needs after 4 years of chaos and innovation. Picture the careful conversations that take place in Julia Mamaea's private apartments, as she lays the groundwork for a palace coup. The Praetorian Guard commanders who visit her don't speak openly of treason. That would be too dangerous, too explicit. Instead, they talk about the empire's need for stability, about the importance of traditional Roman values, about the tragic spectacle of watching a once great institution destroy itself through the excesses of its leadership. The key is the Praetorian Guard itself. These are professional soldiers who've sworn loyalty to the imperial office, but their patience has limits. 4 years of watching their emperor parade around in women's clothing. 4 years of enforcing edicts that violate everything they consider decent and Roman. 4 years of serving someone who seems more interested in shocking people than in governing them effectively. It's more than military discipline can sustain indefinitely. The final straw comes in March 22 CE, when Elagabalus announces his intention to remove all traditional Roman gods from their temples and replace them with images of Elagabal. It's not just religious innovation now, it's active destruction of everything Romans consider sacred. The emperor, who once claimed to be bringing divine enlightenment to the empire, is now threatening to erase the spiritual foundations of Roman civilization itself. Even his most loyal supporters begin to waver. Syrian courtiers who've profited from his favor start making quiet inquiries about safe passage back to their homeland. Roman aristocrats who've adapted to his regime begin positioning themselves for whatever comes next. The palace staff, those invisible servants whose loyalty is essential to imperial survival, start looking for new patrons. Julia Mamaea strikes on March 11, 222 CE, choosing her moment with surgical precision. Elagabalus and his mother are meeting with Praetorian Guard commanders in the palace, ostensibly to discuss security arrangements for another religious festival. But when they arrive at the designated chamber, they find it filled not with loyal protectors, but with armed men, whose faces show nothing but cold determination. Picture that moment when Elagabalus realizes that his divine protection has finally failed him. The boy who once commanded legions through sheer force of personality now faces a room full of soldiers who no longer see him as their emperor, who no longer believe in his divine authority, who've decided that the empire's survival requires his death. There's no dramatic speech, no final theological argument, no last-minute miracle, just the brutal efficiency of professional killers doing what they believe is necessary to save Rome from its own emperor. Julia Soaemias dies first, trying to shield her son with her own body, her ambitions finally consuming her in the most literal way possible. Elagabalus follows moments later, the boy who claimed to be immortal discovering that mortality is the one Roman tradition even he can't escape. But death isn't enough for the conspirators. The body that once wore imperial purple, that once claimed divine status, that once challenged every assumption about gender and power and authority that Roman civilization held sacred, must be desecrated in ways that make the nature of this revolution unmistakably clear. Picture the scene as the corpses are dragged through the streets of Rome, the crowds that gather to witness the spectacle, some cheering the end of what they see as an abomination, others weeping for the destruction of something unprecedented and irreplaceable. The bodies are stripped, mutilated, dragged through sewers, finally thrown into the Tiber River like refuse. It's a rejection not just of Elagabalus as an individual, but of everything he represented. The experiment in imperial transformation, the challenge to traditional gender roles, the attempt to remake Roman religion according to Eastern models, all of it dies with him, swept away by a tide of reaction that will reshape the empire for generations to come. Alexander Severus, Julia Mamakia's son, is proclaimed emperor within hours of his cousin's death. At 13, he's even younger than Elagabalus was when he seized power, but in every other respect he represents a complete reversal of the previous reign's innovations. Where Elagabalus challenged tradition, Alexander embraces it. Where Elagabalus experimented with gender and sexuality, Alexander projects conventional masculinity. Where Elagabalus promoted Syrian religion, Alexander restores Roman gods to their rightful prominence. The new emperor's first acts are calculated to erase his predecessor's legacy as completely as possible. The temple of Elagabal is converted to other uses, its Syrian priests dismissed or executed. The black stone meteorite that served as the focal point of Elagabalus's religious revolution is quietly shipped back to Syria, removing the physical symbol of Eastern influence from the heart of the empire. The edicts that challenged traditional Roman law are repealed. The appointments based on beauty rather than competence are reversed. The Syrian courtiers who profited from the previous regime are exiled, or worse. But erasing a person from history is more complicated than erasing their policies. The 4-year reign of Elagabalus has left scars on the Roman psyche that won't heal easily. The empire has seen what happens when traditional boundaries are challenged, when long-held assumptions about power and gender and religion are called into question. That knowledge can't be unlearned, can't be wished away by imperial decree. Picture the conversations that must have taken place in Roman homes in the months following Elagabalus's death. Parents trying to explain to their children why the emperor who once ruled them was killed. Husbands and wives discussing what they witnessed during those 4 strange years, what it meant, what it revealed about the nature of authority and identity, and the possibilities that exist when conventional rules are suspended. Some Romans undoubtedly felt relief at the restoration of traditional order. The shopkeepers and craftsmen who depend on stability for their livelihoods. The aristocratic families whose status is tied to established hierarchies. The religious conservatives who saw Elagabalus's innovations as blasphemous. For them, Alexander Severus's reign represents a return to sanity, a recovery from a collective nightmare that nearly destroyed the empire. But others must have felt something more complex. The slaves and freedmen who saw in Elagabalus's reign a glimpse of more fluid social possibilities. The women who witnessed a world where gender roles could be negotiated rather than imposed. The followers of foreign religions who experienced a brief moment when spiritual diversity was celebrated rather than merely tolerated. For them, the new emperor's traditionalism might feel less like restoration than like oppression. The historical record, written mostly by Roman aristocrats who approved of Elagabalus's overthrow, presents his reign as an aberration, a cautionary tale about what happens when unworthy individuals are given power beyond their capacity to handle responsibly. They describe him as mad, depraved, a monster whose very existence was an offense against natural law and divine order. But history is written by the survivors, and in this case the survivors had every reason to justify their actions by demonizing their victim. The senators who collaborated in his overthrow, the soldiers who killed him, the aristocrats who profited from his death, they all needed to believe that what they'd done was not just politically expedient but morally necessary. The truth, as always, is more complicated. Elagabalus was certainly no saint, and his reign was undoubtedly chaotic in ways that threatened the empire's stability. But he was also something unprecedented in Roman history. A ruler who used imperial power to challenge fundamental assumptions about identity, authority, and the possibilities that exist when conventional boundaries are erased. Whether you see his reign as a liberation or a catastrophe depends entirely on your perspective. If you believe that traditional Roman values, masculine virtue, religious conservatism, rigid social hierarchies, were essential to the empire's survival, then Elagabalus represents everything that was wrong with the cosmopolitan, multicultural world that Rome had become. His death was necessary to preserve the empire's essential character. But if you believe that those same traditional values were limiting, oppressive, or simply outdated in an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia and included peoples of dozens of different cultures and religions, then Elagabalus represents a missed opportunity, a tantalizing glimpse of what Roman civilization might have become if it had been willing to embrace transformation rather than resist it. The boy emperor, who claimed to be the living embodiment of the sun god, burned brightly and briefly, consuming himself and nearly consuming the empire in the intensity of his vision. His reign lasted only 4 years, but those 4 years revealed possibilities and contradictions that Roman civilization would spend the next 3 centuries trying to resolve. In the end, perhaps that's Elagabalus's true legacy. Not the specific policies he implemented or the traditions he violated, but the questions he forced Romans to confront about the nature of power, identity, and transformation in a world where the old certainties were no longer adequate to address new realities. The empire survived his reign, just as it would survive barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and eventual political fragmentation. But it never forgot the lesson of those 4 strange years, that the boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable, traditional and revolutionary, sacred and profane, are more fragile than anyone wants to admit. Standing again in that Roman street where we began, watching the palace servants hurry past with their eyes downcast and their voices hushed, you realize that what you're witnessing isn't just the end of one emperor's reign, it's the end of an experiment in human possibility, a brief moment when the rigid structures that defined civilization were dissolved in favor of something more fluid, more dangerous, more alive. The golden chariot is gone now, replaced by the more modest transport of a conventional emperor. The exotic music has been silenced, replaced by the traditional hymns of Roman religious ceremony. The painted courtiers have fled or died, replaced by sober administrators in traditional togas. But if you listen carefully to the whispers that echo through the marble corridors, if you pay attention to the dreams that still trouble the sleep of those who witnessed those 4 impossible years, you can still hear the ghost of what might have been, the laughter of a boy who thought he could remake the world according to his own wild vision, and nearly succeeded. The sun god's chosen emperor is dead, but the questions he raised about power and identity, and the courage required to transform an empire, will outlive both his reign and the civilization that destroyed him. In the end, perhaps that's the most fitting epitaph for the transgender boy emperor who turned Rome into an orgy. He dared to imagine that the world could be different, and paid the ultimate price for the audacity of his imagination.